The early morning sun cast long shadows across Mesa, Arizona, as Harold Thompson, an 85-year-old Korean War veteran, carefully made his way down the quiet street. His wooden cane tapped softly against the sidewalk with each step. Even at his age, Harold maintained a strict routine that hadn't changed in 20 years. Every morning, he would wake up at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., brush his teeth with careful precision, and put on his neatly pressed clothes that he had laid out the night before. His favorite veteran's cap, showing his service in the Korean War, was always the last thing he placed on his head before leaving his small, well-kept house. The walk to Pete's Coffee Corner was exactly 3 blocks. Harold knew every crack in the sidewalk, every flower bed, and every neighbor's house along the way. Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived in the yellow house on the corner, would often be watering her roses as he passed. She always gave him a friendly wave, and sometimes they would chat about her grandchildren. "Good morning, Harold," she called out this particular morning. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Harold smiled and tipped his veteran's cap. "Indeed it is, Maria. Those roses are looking mighty fine this year." As he continued his walk, Harold's mind wandered to the old days. The weight of his military medals, carefully stored in a wooden box at home, seemed to press against his heart. He had earned them the hard way, fighting alongside brave men in Korea, some of whom never made it back home. The memories were still fresh, even after all these years. Pete's Coffee Corner came into view as Harold turned the final corner. The small bell above the door chimed as he pushed it open, bringing a smile to his weathered face. The familiar smell of fresh coffee and warm pastries filled the air. Behind the counter, Jenny, the young barista with bright red hair and a kind smile, was already preparing his usual order. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," Jenny called out cheerfully. "1 black coffee and a blueberry muffin coming right up." Harold made his way to his favorite spot, the corner table near the window. It gave him the perfect view of both the street outside and the entire coffee shop. As a soldier, he had learned to always be aware of his surroundings, and old habits die hard. The wooden chair creaked comfortably as he settled in, placing his cane carefully against the wall. The morning newspaper was already waiting for him, just as it had been every day for the past 2 decades. Pete, the shop owner, always made sure to save a copy for his most loyal customer. Harold unfolded it carefully, his hands slightly shaking with age but still strong enough to handle the thin pages with ease. Jenny brought over his coffee and muffin, setting them down gently on the table. "Here you go, Mr. Thompson. I made sure the coffee's extra hot, just how you like it." "Thank you, dear," Harold replied, reaching for his wallet. "You remind me of my Sarah when she was your age, always thinking of others." A shadow crossed his face as he mentioned his late wife's name. Sarah had passed away 5 years ago, and the coffee shop had become even more important to him after that. It was his connection to the world, a place where he still felt part of a community. As Harold sipped his coffee and began reading the morning headlines, he noticed a few other regular customers nodding hello. There was Bob, the retired mailman who always ordered a chocolate croissant. Martha, the kindergarten teacher, rushed in for her morning cappuccino before heading to school. And old George, another veteran who served in Vietnam, sat at his usual table across the room. The morning sunlight streamed through the large windows, creating warm patterns on the worn wooden floor. Harold felt at peace in these quiet moments, surrounded by familiar faces and comforting routines. Little did he know that this peaceful morning routine, which had remained unchanged for so many years, was about to face an unexpected challenge that would test his courage in ways he hadn't experienced since his days in uniform. As he turned the page of his newspaper, the distant rumble of motorcycles echoed from somewhere down the street, but Harold paid it no mind. After all, this was just another ordinary morning at Pete's Coffee Corner, or so he thought. The peaceful atmosphere at Pete's Coffee Corner changed dramatically one warm Tuesday morning. Harold was sitting at his usual spot when the ground seemed to shake with the thunderous roar of motorcycle engines. 5 large motorcycles pulled up right in front of the coffee shop, their chrome parts gleaming in the morning sun. The bell above the door chimed violently as the bikers walked in. They were led by a tall man with a thick black beard and arms covered in tattoos. His leather vest displayed patches that Harold didn't recognize. Behind him came 4 other men, all wearing similar vests and heavy boots that thudded against the wooden floor. Jenny, the young barista, nervously adjusted her apron as the group approached the counter. The leader, who called himself Tank, spoke in a voice that seemed too loud for the small coffee shop. 5 black coffees, sweetheart, Tank ordered, leaning against the counter. And make it quick. Harold tried to focus on his newspaper, but he couldn't help noticing how the other regular customers were reacting. Martha, the kindergarten teacher, quickly finished her coffee and left. Bob, the retired mailman, kept his eyes down, pretending to be deeply interested in his phone. The bikers took over the tables near the entrance, dragging chairs across the floor with a screech that made everyone wince. Their loud laughter and rough language filled the usually peaceful space. One of them noticed Harold's veteran cap and nudged Tank. "Hey, look what we got here," the biker said, pointing at Harold. "One of those old war heroes." Tank turned his attention to Harold, looking him up and down with a smirk. "Which war was it, Gramps? Civil War?" His friends laughed loudly at the poor joke. Harold kept his dignity, calmly turning another page of his newspaper. He had faced real danger in Korea. These men didn't frighten him, but their presence disturbed the peace he had come to cherish. Jenny tried to maintain her professional smile as she brought the bikers their coffee. Her hands were shaking slightly as she set down the cups. Tank reached out and grabbed her wrist, not roughly but firmly enough to make her uncomfortable. "Why don't you join us for a while, pretty lady?" Tank suggested with a grin. I need to get back to work," Jenny replied quietly, pulling her hand away and hurrying back behind the counter. Harold watched this scene unfold, his jaw tightening. He remembered how his unit had protected local villagers in Korea, and his instinct to help others hadn't faded with age. But he also knew that at 85, he couldn't confront 5 young men physically. The morning wore on, and the bikers showed no signs of leaving. They had claimed the space as their own, their loud voices drowning out the usual gentle music that played in the background. Every time the door opened, they would make comments about the customers walking in. Pete, the shop owner, finally emerged from the kitchen. He was a short, round man in his 60s who had always maintained a friendly atmosphere in his shop. He approached the biker's table with a forced smile. "Gentlemen," Pete said politely, "I'm glad you're enjoying our coffee, but could you please keep the noise level down a bit? We have other customers trying to enjoy their morning." Tank leaned back in his chair, boots up on another seat. "Are we bothering you, old-timer? Maybe you should put up a sign saying no bikers allowed if that's how you feel." "That's not what I meant," Pete stammered, backing away slightly. Harold watched as Pete retreated to the kitchen, his face red with embarrassment. The other customers were leaving one by one, throwing apologetic glances at Pete as they hurried out. Even George, the Vietnam veteran who usually stayed for hours, packed up his things and left. As Harold prepared to leave, carefully gathering his cane and newspaper, one of the bikers deliberately stretched out his legs, blocking the path. Harold had to step awkwardly around him, causing him to stumble slightly. The bikers laughed. "Watch your step, Grandpa," Tank called out. "Wouldn't want you to break a hip." Harold straightened his veteran's cap and walked out with his head held high, but inside, his heart was heavy. For the first time in 20 years, his peaceful morning routine had been shattered. As he walked home, leaning a bit more heavily on his cane than usual, he wondered if things would ever be the same at his beloved coffee shop again. Over the next 2 weeks, the situation at Pete's Coffee Corner grew worse with each passing day. Harold tried to maintain his routine, but the bikers seemed to take special pleasure in making his mornings difficult. They were always there before he arrived, their motorcycles parked at odd angles outside, making it harder for him to walk to the entrance. One particularly challenging morning, Harold pushed open the coffee shop door to find the bikers had taken his usual corner table. His chair, the comfortable wooden one that Pete had specifically kept for him, was now being used by Tank to prop up his muddy boots. "Looking for something, old-timer?" Tank asked with a mocking smile. The other bikers snickered, watching Harold's reaction. Jenny quickly approached Harold, concern written across her young face. "Mr. Thompson, I saved you a table by the window," she said, pointing to a different spot. But it wasn't the same. The new table was wobbly, and the chair was hard plastic instead of his familiar wooden one. As Harold settled into his new spot, he noticed how empty the coffee shop had become. The regular morning crowd had dwindled to almost nothing. Martha, the kindergarten teacher, now rushed in and out with a to-go cup instead of sitting to enjoy her coffee. Bob, the retired mailman, hadn't been seen in days. Tank's voice boomed across the shop. "Hey, sweetheart," he called to Jenny. "When are you going to join us for breakfast?" We don't bite? Much. His friends roared with laughter, making Jenny turn red as she hurried back behind the counter. Pete emerged from the kitchen, looking tired and worried. His once bustling morning business was suffering. The few customers who did come in didn't stay long, put off by the bikers' loud behavior and crude jokes. Harold watched as Pete approached Tank's group again, wringing his hands nervously. "Gentlemen, please. My business is suffering. Could you just—" "Your business is suffering?" Tank interrupted, standing up to his full height. He towered over Pete. "Maybe you need some new management. We could help with that, couldn't we, boys?" The threat in his voice was clear, and Pete backed away quickly. As Harold sipped his coffee, his hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from anger. He remembered the day he'd earned his silver star in Korea. His unit had been pinned down by enemy fire, and everyone had been afraid. But they'd found courage together, supporting each other when it mattered most. The morning grew worse when a young mother came in with her small daughter. The little girl, probably around 6 years old, was wearing a pretty pink dress. As they walked past the biker's table, Tank made a loud comment about noisy kids ruining everyone's morning. The little girl clutched her mother's hand tighter, her eyes wide with fear. They quickly ordered their drinks to go and left without the chocolate chip cookies the little girl had been excitedly talking about when they entered. Harold watched them leave, remembering how his own daughter used to love coming to the coffee shop with him when she was young. Sarah, his late wife, would always say that a community needed safe places where people could gather and feel welcome. Jenny brought Harold a fresh cup of coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm sorry about your usual spot, Mr. Thompson," she whispered. "I tried to save it for you, but—" "It's not your fault, dear," Harold assured her, patting her hand gently. But as he looked around the coffee shop, he saw the fear in her eyes, the worry on Pete's face, and the empty tables where his friends used to sit. One of the bikers walked past Harold's table, deliberately bumping it hard enough to spill his coffee. "Oops," the man said with a cruel laugh. "Senior moment." Harold carefully wiped up the spilled coffee with his napkin, his jaw set firmly. In his mind, he could hear the voices of his old military commanders. Sometimes, Thompson, a man has to take a stand. He thought about all the people being hurt by this situation. Jenny, Pete, the regular customers, even that little girl in the pink dress. As he gathered his things to leave, Harold knew something had to change. This wasn't just about his morning coffee anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, just like he'd done all those years ago in Korea. The only question was, what could one 85-year-old veteran do against a gang of bullying bikers? The morning that changed everything started like any other. Harold woke up at his usual time, 6 o'clock a.m., and went through his morning routine. As he stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his veteran's cap, his eyes fell on the old wooden box on his dresser. Inside were his military medals, including the silver star he'd earned in Korea. For a moment, his hand rested on the box, drawing strength from the memories it held. The walk to Pete's coffee corner felt different that morning. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, and Harold's joints ached more than usual. As he turned the final corner, he stopped dead in his tracks. What he saw made his blood boil in a way it hadn't since his days in combat. The bikers had outdone themselves this time. Their motorcycles were parked in a line, completely blocking the entrance ramp that Harold and other elderly customers used to access the coffee shop. His wooden chair, the one Pete had kept specially for him, was lying on its side near the trash cans. Tank and his gang stood nearby, watching and grinning, clearly waiting to see what the old veteran would do. "Looks like you'll have to find somewhere else for your morning coffee, Grandpa," Tank called out, his voice full of mockery. The other bikers laughed, some making exaggerated old man gestures with invisible canes. Harold stood there, leaning on his cane, looking at the scene before him. Through the window, he could see Jenny watching anxiously. Pete was on the phone, probably trying to call the police again, though previous calls had done little good. The bikers were careful to stay just within the law, making it hard for the authorities to do anything. Inside the coffee shop, a few customers watched the scene unfold. Among them was Mrs. Rodriguez, who had walked down from her yellow house to get her morning tea. She looked worried, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. Tank approached Harold, towering over him. "What's it going to be, old-timer? Ready to find a new coffee shop?" In that moment, something changed in Harold's eyes. Those who knew him well, like Jenny and Pete, would later say they saw a glimpse of the young soldier he had once been. His grip tightened on his cane, and he stood straighter, despite the pain in his joints. "You know," Harold said, his voice calm but carrying the authority of someone used to commanding others, "I spent 2 years in Korea watching good men die to protect the freedoms we enjoy. Freedom to live without fear. Freedom to enjoy a simple cup of coffee in peace." Tank's smirk faltered slightly. He hadn't expected the old man to stand his ground. "I've seen bullies before," Harold continued, taking a step forward. "Saw them in Korea. Saw what happened to them, too. You think you're tough because you can frighten kind people like Jenny and Pete? Because you can knock over an old man's chair?" The other bikers had stopped laughing. Something in Harold's voice, in his steady gaze, made them uncomfortable. This wasn't the fearful old man they'd been tormenting for weeks. "What are you going to do about it, Gramps?" Tank asked, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. It was an old flip phone, one his daughter had insisted he carry for emergencies. "I'm going to do something I should have done 2 weeks ago," he said firmly. He opened the phone and pressed a number he hadn't called in years. As he waited for someone to answer, his voice took on a different tone, one that reminded him of his days as a sergeant giving orders. "Hello, Mike. This is Harold Thompson, 38th Infantry Regiment. Yes, it's been a while. Listen, remember how you said the Veterans Association always looks after its own? Well, I need a favor." Tank and his gang watched, uncertain now, as Harold made his call. They didn't know it yet, but their days of terrorizing Pete's coffee corner were about to come to an end. The old veteran had finally reached his breaking point, and he was about to show them what real strength looked like. The morning sky had begun to darken with rain clouds, but Harold Thompson stood tall, his veteran's cap held high, as he prepared for one more battle. Not with guns or grenades this time, but with courage, dignity, and the strength of brotherhood that had never left him. After making his phone call, Harold didn't go home. Instead, he walked into Pete's coffee corner, passing between the bikers with his head held high. The usual morning chaos stopped as he entered. Even Tank seemed unsure what to do next, watching as the old veteran made his way to the counter. "Jenny," Harold said calmly, "I need more coffee today. We're expecting company." Jenny's eyes widened with curiosity as she prepared his usual black coffee. Pete emerged from the kitchen, worry lines creasing his forehead. "Harold, what are you planning?" he whispered. Harold just smiled and took his coffee to a table near the window. This time, he didn't hide behind his newspaper. Instead, he sat facing the door, watching the street with the alertness of a soldier on duty. The first response to his call came faster than even Harold had expected. Within 30 minutes, a familiar face appeared at the door, Mike Johnson, his old Army buddy from the Veterans Association. Mike was 78 now, but still stood straight and tall in his Vietnam veteran's jacket. "Harold," Mike nodded, taking a seat next to his friend. "Made some calls of my own on the way here." Tank and his gang watched suspiciously as more veterans began arriving. First came 3 Desert Storm veterans, still fit and strong despite their gray hair. Then a group of Afghanistan War veterans walked in, some wearing their old unit patches on civilian clothes. Jenny stayed busy making coffee as more veterans arrived. They came from all branches of the military: Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force. Some used canes or walkers, while others moved with the fluid grace of more recent service. Each one nodded respectfully to Harold as they entered. By mid-morning, the coffee shop was filled with veterans of different ages, ranks, and wars. They sat quietly, drinking coffee, some sharing old war stories in low voices. The bikers found themselves surrounded by men and women who had faced real battles, not just playground bullying. Harold's phone kept ringing with more calls. Word had spread through the veterans' community like wildfire. One of their own needed help. Some callers couldn't come in person but promised to spread the word further. Thompson, one elderly Marine veteran, called out from across the room, "My grandson's motorcycle club will be here tomorrow." The good kind of bikers, the ones who respect their elders. Tank and his gang grew increasingly uncomfortable. Their loud voices had quieted, and they huddled closer together near the door. The atmosphere in the coffee shop had changed completely. Where fear had ruled for weeks, now there was quiet strength and dignity. Pete watched in amazement as his coffee shop transformed. Regular customers who had stayed away began returning, drawn by curiosity about the gathering of veterans. Mrs. Rodriguez brought a plate of homemade cookies to share. Martha, the kindergarten teacher, came back for her usual afternoon coffee, smiling as she saw the changed atmosphere. Around noon, a local news reporter showed up with a camera. Someone had called the station about a gathering of veterans standing up against bullying. Harold politely declined to be interviewed, but the reporter took photos of the packed coffee shop. As the day went on, Harold sat quietly at his table, watching his plan unfold. He thought about Sarah, his late wife, and how proud she would have been of this moment. He remembered what she always used to say: sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting back, it's knowing how to gather your friends when you need them. Jenny brought Harold another cup of coffee, her eyes shining with admiration. "Mr. Thompson," she said softly, "how did you know they would all come?" Harold smiled, touching his veteran's cap gently. "Because that's what we do, Jenny. In the service, we learn that no soldier fights alone. That doesn't change just because we're not in uniform anymore." By late afternoon, Tank and his gang had slipped out quietly, their motorcycles disappearing from the front of the shop. But Harold knew this was just the beginning. His decision to call for help had set something bigger in motion, something that would change not just his morning coffee routine, but the entire community around Pete's Coffee Corner. As the sun began to set, Harold looked around at the gathering of veterans, his brothers and sisters in arms, and knew he had made the right choice. Sometimes the bravest decisions aren't about fighting battles, but about knowing when to call in reinforcements. The next morning dawned clear and bright. Harold arrived at Pete's Coffee Corner earlier than usual, at 5:45 a.m. To his surprise, he wasn't the first one there. A group of 30 veterans was already gathered outside the shop, some having driven from neighboring towns during the night. Mike Johnson stood at the front of the group, organizing people with the skill of a former sergeant. Some veterans were in wheelchairs, others stood tall in their old service caps, and a few younger ones wore their combat boots polished to a shine. They formed a line on both sides of the entrance, creating a path of honor. "Morning, Thompson," Mike called out. "Hope you don't mind us joining you for coffee today." Pete arrived to open the shop, his eyes growing wide at the sight of so many people waiting. Instead of his usual worried expression, he wore a broad smile. Jenny was right behind him, carrying extra boxes of coffee beans and muffins she baked early that morning. "The coffee's on the house today, gentlemen and ladies," Pete announced, his voice strong and proud. At exactly 6:30 a.m., the familiar rumble of motorcycles filled the air. Tank and his gang appeared around the corner, but they stopped suddenly at the sight before them. The coffee shop entrance was flanked by veterans of every age and branch of service, all standing in respectful silence. Harold sat at his usual corner table, which Mike and two other veterans had carefully cleaned and restored to its place. His wooden chair was back too, polished and sturdy. As Tank and his group hesitated outside, Harold calmly sipped his coffee. A new sound joined the morning air, more motorcycles, but different ones. A group of veteran bikers, led by the Marine veteran's grandson from yesterday, pulled up behind Tank's group. These riders wore patches showing their military service alongside their motorcycle club insignia. Tank looked trapped, his usual confidence gone. His gang shifted uncomfortably, looking to him for direction. That's when Harold did something unexpected. He stood up, walked to the door, and opened it. "Why don't you boys come in for some coffee?" Harold said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Seems like we need to have a talk." The veteran bikers moved their motorcycles, creating a path to the parking area. Tank hesitated, then nodded slowly. He and his gang parked their bikes and walked toward the entrance, passing between the lines of veterans who stood in dignified silence. Inside the coffee shop, Jenny had set up a large table with coffee and muffins. The veterans moved with quiet efficiency, making space while maintaining their protective presence. Harold took his seat at the head of the table and gestured for Tank to sit opposite him. "Before we start," Harold said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I want to show you something." He pulled out an old, worn photograph and placed it on the table. It showed a young soldier, barely 20, standing with his unit in Korea. "That's me," Harold explained, pointing to the young man in the photo. "And that man next to me was Jack Morrison. He saved my life in Korea, took a bullet meant for me." Harold's voice grew quiet. Jack had a motorcycle too. Loved that machine more than anything. He used to say that real bikers protect their own, look out for their community. Tank stared at the photo, his tough guy facade cracking slightly. For the first time, the other customers in the shop saw something different in his eyes. Was it shame? Understanding? Maybe both. Sir, Tank said finally, his voice rougher than usual, my grandfather was in Korea too. The atmosphere in the coffee shop shifted. Veterans from different eras gathered around the table, sharing stories of service, sacrifice, and the true meaning of strength. Jenny kept the coffee flowing as morning turned to noon, watching in amazement as former enemies became something different. Not quite friends yet, but no longer adversaries. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared with a box of fresh-baked cookies. Martha, the kindergarten teacher, brought her class pictures to show the veterans. Even Bob, the retired mailman, returned to his usual spot, nodding approvingly at the scene. Harold sat back in his wooden chair, watching as his simple plan transformed into something much bigger than he had expected. Sometimes, he realized, the bravest thing you can do is offer your enemy a cup of coffee and a chance to change. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through Pete's Coffee Corner's windows, Tank sat quietly, turning his coffee cup in his hands. The tough biker's usual swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked like deep thought. Finally, he reached into his leather jacket and pulled out a worn photograph of his own. This was my grandfather, Tank said, placing the photo next to Harold's. The picture showed a proud Korean War veteran standing next to a motorcycle. His name was James Miller. He passed away last month. The coffee shop fell silent. Harold leaned forward, adjusting his glasses to look at the photograph, his eyes widened with recognition. James Miller. Harold's voice trembled slightly. From the 24th Infantry Division. Tank looked up sharply. You knew him? Harold nodded slowly, his mind traveling back decades. We were in the same sector in 52. Your grandfather. He was the one who helped carry me to safety after I got my Silver Star. I never knew his first name. We all called him Wheels because he was always talking about the motorcycle he had back home. Tears formed in Tank's eyes, surprising everyone in the coffee shop. The tough biker leader reached up and quickly wiped them away with the back of his hand. That's why I started coming here, Tank admitted, his voice rough with emotion. I saw your Korean War veteran's cap that first day. You reminded me of him. But instead of dealing with my grief, I got angry. I took it out on you, on everyone here. Jenny approached quietly with fresh coffee, her eyes gentle with understanding. The other veterans gathered around, listening respectfully. Even Tank's gang members seemed different, their usual aggressive postures replaced by attentive silence. Grandpa used to tell me stories about the war, Tank continued. About brotherhood, about looking out for each other. You would be so ashamed of how I've been acting. Harold reached across the table and placed his hand on Tank's arm. Your grandfather was a good man, son. One of the best soldiers I knew. And it's never too late to honor his memory by being the kind of man he would want you to be. Mike Johnson, who had been standing nearby, pulled up a chair. Tell us about him, he encouraged. We veterans love hearing stories about our brothers in arms. For the next hour, Tank shared stories about his grandfather. How James Wheels Miller had taught him to ride a motorcycle when he was 12. How he'd always made time to help neighbors with repairs. How he'd run a successful motorcycle repair shop that employed other veterans. As Tank talked, his gang members started sharing too. It turned out that two of them were veterans themselves, one from Iraq and one from Afghanistan. They'd been struggling to adjust to civilian life, finding comfort in the brotherhood of their motorcycle gang, but losing their way in the process. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. My late husband was in Korea too. Maybe that's why we're all here. Not by chance, but because we needed to find each other. Pete brought out a fresh pot of coffee and some old photos of his own father, who had served in World War II. The coffee shop had become more than just a business to him. It was a place where different generations could connect and heal. Harold watched as the afternoon unfolded, amazed at how things had changed. The bullies who had terrorized the coffee shop were transforming before his eyes into men who might yet make their veteran ancestors proud. You know, Tank said thoughtfully, my grandfather's old repair shop is still empty. I've been thinking about reopening it, maybe making it a place where veterans can work, where we can help other vets who are struggling. Harold smiled, remembering his own difficult days after returning from Korea, and how the kindness of others had helped him find his way. "I think your grandfather would like that very much," Harold said. "And if you need any help getting started, well, you got a whole coffee shop full of veterans who know something about new beginnings." The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows, but inside Pete's coffee corner, something bright was growing. Hope, understanding, and the kind of brotherhood that transcends generations. 3 months had passed since that transformative day at Pete's coffee corner. The morning sun shone brightly as Harold made his familiar walk to the coffee shop, but everything else had changed in wonderful ways. As he approached the shop, he smiled at the sight of motorcycles neatly parked in designated spots, no longer blocking the entrance ramp. A new sign hung proudly next to the coffee shop: "Veterans Welcome, Military Discount Available." Pete had put it up after Tank and his group had helped renovate the entire storefront. The bell chimed softly as Harold entered. Jenny was behind the counter, wearing a new apron with American flags embroidered on the pockets, a gift from the bikers' wives and girlfriends who had become regular customers. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," Jenny called out cheerfully. "Your usual?" "Yes, please, dear," Harold replied, making his way to his corner spot. His wooden chair was still there, but now it had company. The corner had been transformed into what the regulars called the Veterans' Corner. Photos of local veterans, including Harold and Tank's grandfather, decorated the walls. A small plaque read, "In honor of those who served, past, present, and future." Tank was already there, dressed not in his leather vest but in a clean work shirt with Miller's Veterans Motorcycle Repair embroidered on the back. He had successfully reopened his grandfather's shop 2 blocks away, employing 5 veterans who needed a fresh start. "Morning, Harold," Tank said, standing to pull out Harold's chair. "Got some good news to share today." The coffee shop had become busier than ever. Bob, the retired mailman, was back at his usual spot. Martha, the kindergarten teacher, now brought her class by once a month for what she called history mornings, where veterans would share age-appropriate stories about service and friendship. Mrs. Rodriguez arrived with her usual basket of fresh-baked cookies, now a staple at the weekly veterans support group that met in Pete's back room. The meetings had been Tank's idea, a way for struggling veterans to find help and understanding. "Tell them the news, Tank," Jenny said excitedly as she brought Harold's coffee and blueberry muffin. Tank smiled proudly. "The Veterans Administration approved our proposal. We're getting funding to expand the repair shop into a full training program for vets, teaching them motorcycle repair, business skills, everything they need to start fresh." Harold nodded approvingly. "Your grandfather would be proud, son." The other bikers, who now called themselves the Guardians, had also changed. They still rode their motorcycles and wore their leather vests, but now they escorted elderly veterans to medical appointments, helped with home repairs, and organized fundraisers for military families in need. Pete emerged from the kitchen, carrying a special cake. "Today's a big day," he announced. 3 months since our community came together, and look at us now. The coffee shop had become more than just a place for morning coffee. It was a hub where different generations connected, where veterans found support, and where the community grew stronger together. Even the local police chief stopped by regularly, amazed at how the former troublemakers had become community leaders. Mike Johnson, who now coordinated veteran activities from his regular table, raised his coffee cup. "To Harold," he said, "the man who taught us that sometimes the bravest thing is reaching out to your enemy with kindness." Harold felt his eyes growing moist as everyone in the coffee shop raised their cups. He thought about Sarah, his late wife, and how much she would have loved seeing this. He thought about James Wheels Miller, Tank's grandfather, and all the other veterans who had paved the way for this moment. "To all of us," Harold said, his voice strong and clear. "To second chances and new beginnings." As the morning sunlight streamed through the windows, Harold looked around at the faces in Pete's coffee corner, the veterans, the bikers, the regular customers, all now part of one extended family. The bullies who had once terrorized this place had become its guardians. The fear that had filled these walls had been replaced by friendship and understanding. Tank put his hand on Harold's shoulder. "You know, some battles are won with courage, some with strength, but you showed us the most important ones are won with kindness." Harold smiled, sipping his coffee in his favorite corner of his favorite coffee shop, surrounded by the unlikely family he had helped create. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from turning them into friends.